What happens when clergy, lawmakers, and a mayor take on an ICE facility in Newark, New Jersey? In a city known for its diversity and commitment to protecting immigrants, a battle is brewing. The Delaney Hall Detention Center became a scene of intense protests in May 2025. Clergy linked arms, their voices rising in prayer and protest. Protesters clashed with police, their cries for justice echoing off the walls. Lawmakers stood defiant, challenging federal immigration enforcement. Two protests, just days apart, shook Newark and reverberated across the nation. It's a story of faith, politics, courage, and defiance. It's about the fundamental rights of immigrants and the role of government. On May 9, 2025, Democratic lawmakers, led by Mayor Ras Baraka, stormed Delaney Hall. On May 12, 50 clergy members formed a human barricade, their voices a chorus of dissent. These actions, captured on camera and shared widely, thrust Newark into the center of a national debate. The protests at Delaney Hall are not just about one detention center or one city. They are a microcosm of a larger struggle over who we are as a nation and what we stand for. On May 12, 2025, the air crackled with tension outside the Delaney Hall Detention Center. A group of nearly 50 clergy members, representing a diverse array of faiths, had gathered to make a stand. They came not with weapons or anger, but with prayers and a deep moral conviction that the treatment of detainees inside Delaney Hall was unjust and inhumane. They linked arms, forming a human chain across the main gate, their bodies a physical manifestation of their commitment to blocking access to the facility. Their voices, strong and unified, rose in unison, chanting slogans like, "Shut it down!" and "No more cages." They prayed for the detainees inside, many of whom were seeking asylum or facing deportation. They prayed for a more compassionate and humane immigration system, and they prayed for the courage to stand firm in their convictions, even in the face of potential arrest. As the clergy held their ground, a tense standoff developed with law enforcement. Newark police officers, some in riot gear, formed a line opposite the protesters, creating a barrier between the clergy and the detention center. The scene was both chaotic and deeply moving, a stark visual representation of the clash between the moral imperative to protect vulnerable populations and the responsibility to uphold the law. The situation escalated when an ambulance, sirens blaring, approached the main gate. The events of May 12 were not the first time Delaney Hall had become a flashpoint for controversy. Just days earlier, on May 9, a group of Democratic lawmakers, led by Newark Mayor Ras Baraka, made national headlines when they allegedly stormed the detention center. Their actions, captured on video and widely circulated online, showed them forcefully entering the facility, demanding access to detainees and denouncing what they called inhumane conditions. The lawmakers' actions were met with swift condemnation from Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, and the Trump administration. ICE officials claimed that an agent had been assaulted during the incident and released a grainy surveillance video that appeared to show a physical altercation. Mayor Baraka was arrested and charged with trespassing, further inflaming tensions between the city and federal authorities. The lawmakers, however, remained defiant, defending their actions as a necessary response to what they called the Trump administration's weaponization of law enforcement and its inhumane treatment of immigrants. In an interview on CNN's State of the Union, Congresswoman Bonnie Watson Coleman, one of the lawmakers who entered Delaney Hall, argued that the Trump administration was lying at all levels about the conditions inside the facility, and that their actions were justified given the urgency of the situation. "That's absurd. That's un-American. That's scary," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. The protests at Delaney Hall exposed a deep rift in Newark and across the nation. Mayor Baraka and the city's immigrant community viewed the detention center as a symbol of oppression, while ICE and the Trump administration saw it as upholding the rule of law. Mayor Baraka, a critic of President Trump, argued the federal government was using Newark to demonize immigrants. "We will not stand idly by while our brothers and sisters are treated like criminals," he declared at a rally, met with cheers. The mayor's arrest galvanized his supporters, but also sparked anger among residents who feared losing federal funding. Some argued the mayor should focus on Newark's challenges, like crime and poverty, rather than symbolic protests. Section 5. ICE fires back, political stunts and the faces of deportation. The Department of Homeland Security and ICE responded forcefully to the protests at Delaney Hall, denouncing them as cheap political stunts orchestrated by grandstanding politicians. Homeland Security Assistant Secretary Tricia McLaughlin accused the protesters of endangering the lives of ICE agents, staff, and even the detainees themselves by obstructing access to the facility. McLaughlin, in a heated press conference, challenged the protesters' narrative, framing the detainees not as victims, but as dangerous criminals who posed a threat to public safety. "Who do they want released?" she demanded, her voice dripping with disdain. "Child rapists, murderers, drug traffickers, Mississippi, 13 gang members or known terrorists." ICE officials released statistics highlighting the criminal history of some detainees at Delaney Hall, including individuals convicted of violent crimes and gang activity. They also pointed to recent ICE operations that had resulted in the arrest of individuals wanted for serious crimes in their home countries, including murder, rape, and drug trafficking. DHS social media accounts amplified these messages, sharing images of detainees alongside descriptions of their alleged crimes, and using hashtags like #NoSanctuary for criminals and #Enforce the Law. Section 6. Public Opinion: A Nation Grapples with Immigration and Enforcement. The protests at Delaney Hall and the subsequent response from ICE ignited a fierce debate about immigration policy and the role of sanctuary cities. Public opinion on these issues remained sharply divided, reflecting the deep partisan polarization that characterized American politics in the mid-2020s. A Pew Research Center poll conducted in the wake of the Delaney Hall protests found that a majority of Americans, 83%, supported deporting at least some undocumented immigrants. Support for deportation was highest among Republicans at 95% and Independents at 81%, while Democrats were more divided, with 65% in favor of deporting some undocumented immigrants. The poll also found strong bipartisan support at 97% for deporting undocumented immigrants convicted of violent crimes. However, there was less consensus on deporting undocumented immigrants who had committed nonviolent crimes, with 72% support, or those who had not been convicted of any crimes, with 53% support. These findings underscored the complex and often contradictory nature of public attitudes toward immigration. While a majority of Americans supported some level of enforcement, there was no clear consensus on how far the government should go in deporting undocumented immigrants. Section 7. Human Rights versus Law and Order, a Delicate Balancing Act. The protests at Delaney Hall raised fundamental questions about the balance between human rights and law enforcement. Supporters of the protests argued that the Trump administration's immigration policies were cruel and inhumane, and that civil disobedience was a necessary tool to resist injustice. They pointed to the plight of asylum seekers fleeing violence and persecution, only to be detained indefinitely in overcrowded and unsanitary conditions. They argued that the government had a moral obligation to treat all people with dignity and respect, regardless of their immigration status. Critics of the protests, however, argued that the mayor, lawmakers, and clergy were undermining the rule of law and putting public safety at risk. They argued that entering a federal facility without authorization was a serious offense, and that the protesters' actions set a dangerous precedent for disrespecting law enforcement. They also argued that the protesters were ignoring the rights of victims of crime by advocating for the release of individuals who had been convicted or charged with serious offenses. The debate over Delaney Hall highlighted the inherent tension between upholding the law and protecting human rights, a tension that has long been at the heart of the American experiment. Section 8. Newark on the National Stage, a Microcosm of America's Divide. The protests at Delaney Hall thrust Newark into the national spotlight, becoming a focal point for the broader debate over immigration, sanctuary cities, and the role of government. The city, with its long history of welcoming immigrants and its reputation as a progressive stronghold, became a battleground for competing visions of America. Conservative media outlets seized on the protests as evidence of liberal lawlessness and the dangers of sanctuary cities, arguing that Newark's policies were endangering public safety and emboldening criminals. They pointed to the alleged assault on an ICE agent during the May 9th protest, as proof that the protesters were violent and dangerous. Progressive media outlets, on the other hand, framed the protests as a righteous uprising against the Trump administration's inhumane immigration policies. They highlighted the stories of detainees who had been separated from their families, denied access to legal representation, and subjected to harsh conditions. The protests also sparked a wave of activism across the country, inspiring solidarity demonstrations in cities like New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles. Section 9. The fight continues: legal battles and the future of protest. In the aftermath of the Delaney Hall protests, legal battles ensued, with both sides digging in for a protracted fight. Mayor Baraka vowed to fight the trespassing charges against him, arguing that his actions were justified given the circumstances. The ACLU filed a lawsuit on behalf of the clergy members who had been arrested, alleging that their First Amendment rights had been violated. The lawsuit claimed that the police had used excessive force against peaceful protesters and that the city had violated its own sanctuary city policies by cooperating with ICE. Meanwhile, the Trump administration doubled down on its hardline immigration policies, vowing to crack down on sanctuary cities and increase deportations. The administration threatened to withhold federal funding from cities that refused to cooperate with ICE, and it ramped up its rhetoric against undocumented immigrants, painting them as a threat to national security and economic prosperity. The battle over Delaney Hall was far from over, and its outcome had the potential to shape the national conversation on immigration for years to come. Section 10. A call to action. Where do we go from here? The protests at Delaney Hall were a stark reminder that the fight for immigrant rights is far from over. As the nation grapples with the legacy of the Trump era and the ongoing debate over immigration reform, the events in Newark serve as a call to action for all Americans. What role should sanctuary cities play in protecting undocumented immigrants? How can we balance the need for secure borders with the moral imperative to treat all people with dignity and respect? And how can we create a more just and humane immigration system that reflects our values as a nation? These are not easy questions, but they are questions that we can no longer afford to ignore. The time for complacency is over. The time for action is now. Contact your elected officials, get involved in your community, and most importantly, never stop fighting for what you believe in. The future of our nation and the fate of millions of immigrants depends on it.